I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows, and welcome to Gulf Coast Confidential Conversations, where my co-host, Pam Hill, and I talk about the cases I cover in my true crime series, Gulf Coast Confidential, as well as other headline-making crimes, and Lord knows there's plenty of those.
Plenty.
Well, and it's something we can both relate to. I've covered a lot of murders, mysteries, and cold cases in my career, and my goal is always to give victims a voice. Pam has sadly experienced tremendously violent crimes in her own life firsthand. In 2013, her sister was murdered by her own son, Pam's nephew, and she, of course, is passionate about helping others overcome trauma in their own lives. So in this episode, we're digging into the documentary series about reality TV stars, the Duggar family, called Shiny Happy People, Duggar Family Secrets.
Oh, my goodness.
I know, a little bit. It was a very good title, and it certainly it delivered on its promise.
It
So
did.
It reveals what was happening behind the scenes of that enormously popular and, as we learned, very lucrative reality TV series about the Duggar family, 19 and counting. Several members of the family were interviewed for it, including Jill Duggar and her husband, who both actually stepped away from the spinoff series Counting On because they described living a nightmare behind the scenes, in part because of the family's ties with a fundamentalist religious organization called the Institute in Basic Life Principles. They say there was rampant sex abuse, fraud, exploitation within the family, as well as IBLP, all in service to a male-dominated system of authority where suffering was considered holy, especially for women who are taught to submit to their husbands and the IBLP. They described a way of life where having your own wants, needs, opinions, or even ability to say no, your ability to stand up for yourself, was not only considered undesirable, it was systematically broken down using shame, fear, and control. So, Pam, that was a powerful documentary. I think we both got a lot out of watching that series. And I have two words for you: blanket training.
And I have three for you. What the feezy? That was something crazy.
It was. And, you know, I've covered other stories over my career that are cult-based, if you will. And many of the themes in this particular documentary, I feel like, are similar to other stories that I've covered. You know, this misogynistic, patriarchal system where women are made to be less than and silenced. And then, of course, all the abuse that follows in that wake when you're too afraid to stand up for yourself or taught that you don't even matter. But what were some of your big takeaways?
Well, the first one I had was that girls don't matter. And it made me sad because girls do matter. We can do anything. And praise God, I was raised by daddy and mama and grandparents and uncles that said, girls matter. Girls matter as much as anybody, as much as boys. So it was really sad to think about, you know, sometimes you just have to praise God that you were born where you were, to whom you were, and at the time you were.
I know. Now, did you actually watch the show when it was on TLC regularly?
I did. I watched it. I didn't follow it all the time, but I was fascinated at the logistics of it. It's sort of like running a small business with an executive with a firm hand, but, you know, how the mother speaks so softly. And I'm sure that was a trained voice because we all know she was a cheerleader.
Yes.
So she can scream, cheerlead. You can't get up there and whisper cheer, but they're taught to be feminine and soft-spoken, and that goes along with the blanket training. You know, that blanket training, basically what they did was when a child was real little, like crawling little, not even crawling.
6 months old, they said.
Baby. Put them on a blanket. First, notice which toy or object was their favorite and put it just out of reach of them. And when they would reach for it, they would scold them, maybe verbally or a little tap or something. Anyway, it got more progressive. And so there you are, a little being coming into the world, and you're being taught, here's your boundaries. Don't get out of here. That's your favorite. You may not have it until I say so.
All right. It's all about control and basically beating the fight out of them.
Yeah, I don't like that. That made me so sad when I saw that part, because we, at least my growing up, we celebrate when a child can hold their own little toy or shake it. I think normal parenting does, and normal development does. Can you imagine how shy and coquettish, and maybe that's what they want?
Oh, absolutely. They want them pliable. They want them to not argue, to not fight back, to not even want anything other than what they're being told to want. And I think that's the goal, is to make them a blank slate so they can fill them up with the poison that they tried to fill them up with. But it was a fascinating documentary. And you're right. I did not watch the show. I never have been a huge fan of reality television for whatever reason. But just having had a career in television, I know what that's like. I know the difference between what you see on camera and what's happening behind the scenes, the production that goes into even a news program or a true crime program. Obviously, there's just a lot of editing. There's a lot of discussion. There are a lot of people behind the camera that the folks at home never see that are part of the process. And so I think that was revealing and interesting to me, that they could hide this abuse that was taking place openly within the family, within this organization. Basically, this television show, as they brought out so adeptly in this documentary, was their PR tool to say, hey, look how great the IBLP is. Look at how great our teachings are, because it's not enough that we believe it. We want you to believe it too.
Right.
Not only do we want you to believe it, we think you should believe it.
Right. It's wholesome. It's wholesome. What's wrong with you? You don't like wholesome things? I mean, basically, it was gaslighting at its best, and brainwashing and breaking one's spirit. And then go, but don't you love Jesus? You know, what's wrong with you that you don't want to comply or be obedient? You know, and I find sometimes I use that word, even as a grown-up, when I would say something, I was being obedient to my dad, you know. And it's a privilege to have parents that care about you. And I think sometimes that's packaged as care. But I also think about when I was looking at the promo of it, where all the 19 kids have their violins and they're sitting up there. It looks cute. I appreciate that picture. But I got to look and I was like, does everybody have a shiny, happy face, a yellow face on their face? And I got to look and I was like, no, Jim Bob doesn't. And then further in my mind, this is how my mind thinks, and I was like, well, does the mommy? And I couldn't even think of her name. She had been minimized so much. And I had to go look up her name. It's Michelle.
Yeah. But you're right. He's comfortable. He doesn't have to put on a fake face, because he's totally fine where he is. He feels in control. He doesn't have to pretend to be something he's not, because he's in charge.
Right. And what I say, he's at the top of the umbrella. You know, they have that little umbrella. At the top is Christ or Jesus. Underneath that is Father. Underneath that is Mother. And underneath that is children.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me. That's one of their founding principles, and everything's built on that. Everything's geared towards submit and authority. And I thought that was interesting, too, when one of the family members was, or maybe it was a church member, or former member, if you will, that had talked about how they divided them up into two categories of service. One was mercy, and one was, do you remember what the other one was?
The other, it was basically like
a leadership
prophets
position. Prophets.
And mercy givers.
Yes, prophets and mercy givers, and that women were always the mercy givers and men were always the prophets. And that the mercy giver was expected to sacrifice and, you know, love is pain, love is suffering. It's always better to put the husband first, the church first. Basically, submit to your father, submit to your pastor, if you will, or the leader of your house.
Or your brothers.
Or your brothers. I mean, it's just, it's a frightening, and it's a pattern that's, again, not even unique to this particular cult. Let's call it what it is. I mean, you know, I told you about, I saw Be Sweet and Pray.
Yeah, you told me about that.
Or it was Keep Sweet and Pray. It's about the Warren
obey.
Jeffs. Keep sweet, pray, and obey. That's right.
You forgot the last part.
It's a very important thing for that particular organization too. But very similar themes. You know, just women. It's a privilege to serve men, and you have to control how you behave and how you dress and how you present yourself and how you talk, because you're just there to encourage them. And support them, and your thoughts, wishes, desires don't matter. In fact, you will find joy in submitting. And so, again, you talk about the gaslighting. It's just it was just so sad going back to the Duggar documentary to hear these kids talk about how they were shamed through the word of God, essentially. The word was twisted in order to have fear and control over them and to cause them to self-doubt and not to self-examine.
Right.
Because that's the last thing those people in charge wanted, was a smart person who was going to self-examine and challenge the system
Right.
in any way.
Right. And it is so confusing because, I mean, I believe in having a servant's heart toward mankind and other
Yes.
people, but I don't believe in being indentured and in servitude like a slave. And that's what kind of happened with them categorizing you as a mercy giver. Basically, a mercy giver, they were teaching these girls to be mercy givers at 11 and 12 years old under the guise of, you're my buddy. The mom's like, you're my buddy. This is my personal opinion. I don't think you should have children to raise the other children.
No,
you
it's,
know,
it's
that's
kids having kids or kids raising
right.
kids, I should
And so
I should say.
they're taught you're supposed to always be exhausted. You're supposed to always jump up and do, and then that doesn't result in good self-care, good self-confidence. Want you to try any harder. We're back to blanket training. Don't reach for what you want.
What
I'll
you want
give
doesn't
what-
matter.
That's right. I'll give you what you need and when you need it.
It is.
So sad.
It is, and it did. It broke my heart. There was another couple that had married, and they had both basically experienced that destructive lifestyle. And they said they had married, and everything had been fine until the birth of their child. And then, so often, that is the case with any relationship, even when somebody hasn't been through the trauma that they experienced. You know, when you have a child, all the programming that you had as a child and the parenting that you were brought up in kind of comes to the surface, and,
Right.
and maybe some issues that haven't been addressed. And it seemed like that's what happened with this particular couple. They had both gone through this terrible cult-like upbringing. They have a child of their own. And suddenly there's this pressure and this self-doubt and this, oh my gosh, can I do this? He starts drinking. You know, she turns to other coping mechanisms. She's basically being a single mom for a little while. But they manage to heal and come back together and are stronger. But it is overcoming that messaging that is so consistently pounded and programmed is the better word
Yeah.
into their brain.
Right. It's the gaslighting. But what was so good about them, they found each other, they understood each other.
Yes.
They knew they had both been homeschooled, and nothing against homeschooling. I think whoever can homeschool is brilliant because that is a big task.
Yes.
But this was part of their institute. The next thing was the ATI, the Advanced Training Institute, or whatever that was called, where it was basically their homeschooling program. And they had the books of wisdom, and they just kept rereading them every year. And Bill Gothard, the preacher,
Founder, IBLP.
evangelist, whatever he wants to call himself, of this movement, he basically had a heavy hand in writing these things, and he told what he wanted and how he wanted it. And keep in mind, this is Bill Gothard, has 0 children and never been married.
Right, but telling all these other families how to raise their families, all these women
Right.
how to be wives, how to be mothers, all these children how to be subservient to not just their parents and their dad, but the whole system. And
Right.
all the while he's making lots and lots of money off of it. And so,
Oh yeah, he's making bank.
yeah, and I think, and Jim Bob Duggar wanted to be just like him. Apparently admired him, you know, and was following right in his footsteps. Took over when Gothard ends up being arrested or you know, had basically kicked out of IBLP when he was under investigation for
Right.
sex abuse.
Right. Just keeping on with this, what we've been talking about, these people in this movement or religion or cult would love to be in his presence. They kind of had him like as a rock star, but he would quickly deflate them, use them for whatever they had, charisma, looks, whatever he wanted around him. They call that, they tell the women, men have an eye problem. You know, you don't need to be basically eye candy or eye problem for them. So he wanted one girl to have extra curly hair. He didn't like straight hair. So she had to have extra curly hair. And he would tell them how to discipline and spank their children. He even had one of his pastors have a volunteer send their son up there so the man could spank him across his knee, which looked very weird and like pervert city.
No, it totally did. That freaked me out.
It made me so uncomfortable to watch that. And then when he took the little boy by the shoulders, and the man even called himself daddy, and he took the little boy, little boy by the shoulders, and he said, "I don't think you believe that spanking good enough." And he said, "Now give me a hug." And then he spanked him again. And this whole bunch of people are watching this freakish show. You know, it's like, I can't even put the words with it. It just about
No.
made me, I was just like, who sits there and lets somebody do that to their kid?
It's heartbreaking, and and again, you hear similar stories, even in Scientology. That there were stories of people who escaped that basically cult-like system where they had their children there, and how those children were treated, and it's just their family members would say time and time again, whether it was Scientology or whether it was Warren Jeffs or whether it's IBLP, that the person that they knew changes and becomes basically part of this organism that is this cult, and things that they might not have tolerated before seemed perfectly normal. To your point,
Right.
that older man publicly in front of everyone in a church meeting, if you will, a group meeting, taps this kid demonstrating a proper spanking and insists this boy gives him a hug twice, and it's very uncomfortable to watch. It was definitely one of those gross moments to me that kind of make you want to go, are you all seeing this? Do
I
you
know.
not see this?
Right.
This is wrong.
Right.
But apparently to those that are watching it, they don't think it's wrong.
I think some of them might have thought it was wrong, but they took it in because even the way the man was
squelched
sitting,
their doubts.
he had his legs wide open and
Yeah.
pulled the little
Ugh.
boy in front of him and made him hug him like that. And I'm like, children know if somebody's icky around them.
Yes, you're exactly right. And as a parent, what I want for my daughter, what I would want for any child is the freedom to be the person that they were made to be, to explore their talents, to make the most of their gifts. And that requires a little trial and error. It requires good boundary setting. You don't want people to be able to walk all over you. And it's good, obviously, to have a little diplomacy
Right.
and learn how to couch things a little bit more appropriately. But at the same time, when you are a kid, the fact that they went out of their way, again, going back to that blanket training, to crush that out of them, it's heartbreaking. I mean, that is how you make a good cult member, essentially.
It is.
You empty
Just
them out.
obey. Don't ask questions. And I remember back growing up, I would ask a lot of questions, and my parents would answer them. And I always had big feelings. I was one of those kind of people with a lot of emotions. And I loved that my mother would validate my emotions. Like she could say, "I can see you're frustrated," or being 12 years old and having zero power is frustrating. And she would walk me through it. She said she could see me, so it was okay to have that feeling.
Yeah, I know. And it's interesting, too, that you can't help but think as a parent how you would treat your own kids and put yourself in that position when you hear them talk about the story.
Right.
And again, it's all based on what was actually happening in this family, what some of the agendas were behind the scenes of what on the surface just seemingly, like you said, was a wholesome family show. Yeah, so they have a lot, but it's okay. Yeah, so the kids are raising their siblings. They all seem to be happy and it's working fine. When really behind the scenes, it was so much more manipulative. It was controlling. The kids were signing contracts that they didn't even read. Some of them were becoming adults, and neither the dad or TLC was changing the documents, the contracts, to show that they were adults and that they needed to be consulted, because those kids never saw a dime, at least not the ones that have, since moved on from the show and we're speaking about it in this documentary. But it was just interesting, too, the political agenda behind it all. That it wasn't just, oh, wow, check it out. Here's this family that's had a lot of kids, and aren't they fun to watch and oh, so wholesome. They're like, we want everyone to live like this. And we're going to use this as a way to show you how great we are, when behind the scenes they're saying that this is all secular, that television is bad, that women behaving and dressing a certain way is inappropriate, et cetera, on down the line. The world is a rotten place that needs to be fixed. Normally, we would turn up our nose at television, but this is our ministry.
Right.
And oh, by the way, we're making tons of money. And oh, by the way, it's a great PR thing.
Right.
And oh, by the way, Jim Bob, it set you up to take over.
For Gothard.
Yeah, when Gothard was forced out for his perversion.
Right. Well, and then also while we're at it, why it's so great, there's a chink in the armor that just happens to happen. At a certain point, Jim Bob was in politics in Arkansas.
Yes.
And so he passed a bill about sexual offenders or whatever. Well, the chink in the armor gets a little more wider because, lo and behold, Josh, the oldest child, I believe he had been accused of inappropriate sexual touching, and not just of other girls, but his sisters as well.
Yes.
And they had those girls go on
Starting
TV.
when he was 12.
Right. But remember, his daddy wrote this bill, okay, when he was in whatever it was, State House of Representatives or whatever. And so
Yes, in
they,
Arkansas.
Right. They had the girls, yes, he touched them. But then they minimized it. They went on there and they said it was just over their clothes. And
We
it
didn't
was,
even know it. We
right,
were asleep.
Right. And we sent him away to Gothard's school there. And what they did was they just pulled him out back and forth, you know, when it was convenient. And they said, well, we're not going to talk to Josh about it. We'll talk to Jesus about it. And I want to disclose right here, I love organized religion. I'm a Baptist, and I love my church, and I love what my church has done for me personally, going through intense grief. I don't think I could have made it without my church family, going to church, being taught certain ways and things like that. But, you know, they are not zealots, and they're not a cult. You know,
That's
so
right.
and you can ask questions. Actually, you're free to ask questions, and they'll be answered. So this isn't bashing religion. We both believe in religion.
Right. Well, in this particular religion, IBLP, in my personal opinion, it is not true Christianity, or at least the Christianity that I believe in,
Right.
which is, you know, the freedom to choose, the freedom to love. They don't give people freedom.
Right.
It's basically the freedom to choose our way, or you get kicked out, or you get punished.
Right. Well, they're not necessarily recruiting someone like you or I. We would not
No,
work.
that's true.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's another reason. That's what I took away from the documentary on Warren Jeffs, as well as this one, is that they want to keep this system going. They want to draw in families because they want to have these people creating more, you know, bringing more children into this world that they can mold and teach and set on the path of what they believe, so they can keep the money rolling in. And, you know, with the Warren Jeffs situation, it was create more girls so we can marry them off to these
Right.
older men, and then we're making more and more money off these men that just want to basically marry and have sex with girls. But it's all done under the guise of, oh, look how sweet and wholesome it is, when there was just a lot of sexual abuse
Right.
that was happening and other types of abuse.
And-
And that's what we saw with IBLP too.
If you look at it as a business, the girls are the better return on investment, because they bring in the banging shows, like we said before, the births, the marriages, the cooking, the
free
working.
labor.
I mean, what are you looking at the other way except someone bossing someone around? And to get back to Josh, anyway, he is in prison right now for 12 years.
Yes.
And they always just seem to wax over that. And, oh, that little thing happened. That's important.
Yes, the whole storyline was important,
Yeah.
especially because during that time the TV show was on TLC and so popular and being touted as so family friendly and wholesome. He was molesting his sisters. He was exhibiting behavior that was certainly something that they needed to address early on, and instead they swept it under the rug. Just was seems to be, according to other family members, the whole organization and their family's MO. And then it comes to catch up with them. And when it does come to light, again, they prance those poor sisters out there to basically say, you know, it wasn't that bad to fall on the sword.
Yeah.
And then finally, when he is exposed, you know, several years later, when a federal an investigation by the police basically traced pornography to his IP address, and they realized that he had been using his tech skills, which I thought was interesting, to get around what they called accountability software, which is like,
Yeah, don't go there.
don't look at bad porn,
Right.
you know, or whatever. But he had found a way to get around it, and they found files and files of child pornography, and that's what struck out to me too. I thought it was well done in the documentary, is the graphics that they pulled up of what police described the kind of videos that he was looking at. And it was, you know, basically he got off on watching kids suffer. He got off on watching them be tortured. He got off on seeing them in pain.
Yeah.
This from a son who was given every opportunity, but raised in this environment where everything you want is okay. Everybody else, especially women, are here to serve you.
Yeah.
And instead of appreciating and you know, being a loving husband or a loving son, he basically in turn says, I want more and more and more. It's not enough, and I
It's
have
still
to
not
dominate.
enough, because he's just there for 12 years, and they'll minimize that somehow. But to add to that, it wasn't just his sisters. It wasn't just the lady there. He had a wife during this time,
that was
Anna,
heartbreaking.
who had been raised in this environment, taught to not think for herself, to submit. You know, I would hear my mom say sometimes, my mom would listen to John Hagee sometimes, and, you know, they'd start this stuff like, the man's always right, and this, that, and the other. That's what people take away from that.
Right.
And my mother would sometimes, in her little silly self, she would say, well, even John Hagee says you can't follow a parked car, you know.
Well, if John Hagee said it.
John Hagee said it made me laugh every time. But also, you know, Josh was out there. He's big time. He's up in there with the Ashley Madison crew that basically is an internet thing that says, hey, we'll teach you how to cheat while you're still married, and we'll make it cool and fun. And this is what the celebrities do.
That's right.
And
he found
did.
the porn star.
Yes,
that
he
way.
did. He found her, and he kept cheating with her while Anna, his wife, was pregnant. And then he paid the porn star thousands and thousands of dollars to
Right.
quiet.
Who does that remind you of?
Yeah, plenty of people. But, you know, so I mean, like, even these folks were teaching people, Amy Grant, Winnie the Pooh's bad. Look at Eeyore, he's sad all the time.
How are you going to say Amy Grant's bad?
I don't know. I like Amy Grant.
I love her.
like her. And they didn't like the rock and roll and stuff. When they're like, speak softly. I mean, it's just being gaslit.
Yeah, well, it's undermining everything that's positive or could potentially take them down a path that's out from under their control, is how it seemed to me. But
unreal.
it was just so interesting, again, that it wasn't just this, you know, they wanted to portray him as like the lovable goofball, like, you know,
Just Jim Bob.
bumbling through.
Yeah.
But really, behind the scenes, he was part of this very wealthy, what they'd say, multi-million dollar organization, and that they were in it for the long haul. I thought that was a interesting part of it too, that they have this bigger plan called the Joshua Plan, which is a decades-long, multi-generational plan to place their homeschool graduates in positions of power and political influence. And they talk about some of those candidates that have actually already made it and gotten into office. And then the abuse scandals that followed them, too. I just thought the whole documentary was really well done as showing, like, this is the fruits of the labor of this organization. Right. It's not just one or two examples. It is consistent because this is the product of what they teach. This is the product of this patriarchal, misogynistic, fundamentalist lifestyle that they want you to believe. Actually, they insist that you believe it. It's not enough that you're living your own life. You know, they want to control yours. And they're populating the world with as many kids as they can have. And they want them to do this homeschooling so that basically they're going to be like, I guess, sleeper cells. And when they get into political power, they're just going to undermine all of our civil rights.
Right.
You know, we'll be in the handmaiden's tale, I guess. But to do it all with, again, the shiny, happy face. When behind the scenes, they're just being essentially emotionally bled out. It's a soul-crushing way to live if you're not a dude.
Right. You're worked to death. You physically are exhausted. You can't push back. Even on some of the shows, they had like little cues that they would do. I'm sure you've seen directors give you cues and stuff for being on TV and stuff, but they said 3 fingers when they do show them 3 fingers, like I guess a Girl Scout pledge or something. That meant smile. So like little trained circus animals and stuff. So it wasn't genuine. It wasn't real. It wasn't showing all that. You know, it was packaged. But I found it very interesting that the program that's supposed to keep things going forward is called the Joshua Program. I'm sure that's biblical in nature, but I find it very interesting that the son that brought their whole empire down, his name is Joshua.
I know. It is interesting. I thought, too, that, of course, you know, I just love, because I have that heart for victims, and especially victims of sex abuse, because it is such a nasty, heinous, insidious form of abuse, especially when it's done to children, because they blame themselves and they don't know how to unburden themselves so many times. And it just is a pain and wounds that they carry with them and influences and impacts their life in so many ways. So again, I say all that to say, when I'm watching some of those young women talk about how, you know, the abuse that they endured at the hands of Bill Gothard, that he would select, he told his assistant, he goes, make sure you keep an eye on her, basically make sure she doesn't go anywhere. And then here she was being abused by her own father. He's playing both ends against the middle, telling her father, let her come up here to headquarters, which is the rock star assignment, if you will, at 14 years old. And he's like, let her come up here. And then when she was up there, he tells the dad, she's going to be so submissive to you. She can't wait to come back and submit to your authority. And then he tells her, I've taken care of your dad. You don't have to submit to him anymore. You submit to me. So basically, she's just being treated like a piece of meat.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking. So when they did pursue legal action against him, I was just so happy for them. And I thought it was a great way to kind of wrap up the series, and the fact that, they didn't win because of the statute of limitations. The case was dropped. And then Gothard, in his arrogance, went right back after them.
Oh, yeah.
to countersue.
You're not going to get away with it. They're going to keep, there's always going to be the punch back. How dare you question my authority? I've already shown you where I am, and I've shown you where you are. Know your place. Girls don't matter. You are shameful. People that use shame to manipulate people, that is very low blow.
It's insidious.
Yes, because how are these girls going to recover? I actually like the cousin Amy that could get in their life.
know.
I loved her because she was
wonderful.
the sensible one. And she was the one that goes, hey, something don't look right here. And then I love those women that were in recovery, the ones that
Yes,
push
me
back
too.
and the ones that realize you don't have to be of the world, but you have to live in it. Everything's not a 7,000 square foot, we make 29 loaves of bread for breakfast every day house. That's all ridiculous. So I'm glad there was a peek into here. And shame serves no one.
No, and it's like I said, it's just heartbreaking. So I do think that was empowering for them to be able to, when he did countersue and they had to go before the court and basically give their side of the story, it was just touching to me to see how empowering that was for them to be able to go there and share their story with the court, and how the court listened, how the judge validated them, and he did not find that Gothard had grounds to continue on trying to pursue in a countersuit. So they got to be heard, they got to be validated, they were vindicated to a certain extent. It may not have been the exact day in court that they wanted, but it was a day in court, and they got to speak up. They got to take their voice back and say, you don't get to keep me in the dark anymore. You don't get to silence me anymore.
Right, and you point right at who that person is. And as someone that's gone through something as horrible as my sister getting murdered, yes, you are a victim. You can't live as a victim forever, but you have been victimized. And if you don't deal with that, you're psychologically going to be messed up your whole life. The reason you and I have gotten together is I needed someone to hear my sister's story, and I needed them to hear it the honest way, at least what I experienced. I'm not saying that's the only way, but the truth wasn't getting told. And it's been 10 years of this. People are like, put that down. I have to tell her story. I have to tell about the corruption and the injustice and the betrayal and just the
apathy in the system that
yeah.
just led to mistake after mistake.
And nobody cares, but I do. And my sister's fight is my fight. And these young ladies' fight is our fight too. Nobody should have to ask for a seat at the table of humanity. Nobody. Not of your gender, not of your color, not of socioeconomic class, not of intellect, not of even cleanliness. You have a seat at the table of humanity, and you go sit there.
Absolutely. And I'll be right there too.
Thank you.
Well, you think there's anything else you'd like to add? I feel like we've covered it, but if there's
I think so. It's just like, speak up, do what's right, do the next right thing. You got sense. You don't need somebody to tell you what to do all the time. But I'm not saying disobey your parents. We need structure. We need to obey our parents. But you are not wrong for having questions. And if your intuition tells you to push back, or at least talk to a trusted other.
Right, exactly. Listen to your gut.
Right.
Listen to those warning flags.
Right.
And sometimes if you don't trust your mind because you have been in a manipulative situation, trust your body.
Right.
Your body will have a
It will
physical
tell you.
reaction as well. Maybe your heart's beating fast. Maybe you're sweating. Maybe you're nervous. Maybe you're anxious and you don't know why. Listen to your body.
Right,
That's
right.
definitely something I found has been helpful.
I think that's wonderful. Well, this has exhausted me.
I know. We're just going to have to go. I'm going to give you 3 fingers, Pam. I want you to smile. Because we're going to say bye. But thank you so much for joining us on Gulf Coast Confidential Conversations. And if you haven't seen Shiny Happy People, Duggar Family Secrets, then you can check it out. It's a 4-part series on Netflix. And we thank you so much for joining us. You can watch this episode and many others on my YouTube channel, Gulf Coast Confidential, as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.